Hi, I'm Mary Kupczynski, the CEO of Regulator. Welcome to this week's Regulatory Roundup. Thank you to all of our veterans, especially my favorite Marine, Mr. Larry Myers. We're living the dream, soldier. Don't wake me up. This week there were 1,632 alerts from 356 unique U.S. regulators, and 343 had to do with coronavirus. And since we're getting pretty good at this, here are some new stats for you. This week we had 23 alerts having to do with veterans, 51 alerts having to do with the elections, 32 in our weekly FinTech feed, and while the number this week is low, only 3 alerts in our weed feed, it still packs a pretty good punch. The regulator of the week is the United States Department of Justice, starting with the lawsuit to block Visa's acquisition of the hot fintech firm Plaid. But that's not all. The DOJ has been coordinating heavily with Brazil, resulting in 2 major takedowns this week. The first, called Operation 404, was a massive seizure of Brazilian-based digital piracy sites, and the second, called Operation YPTO, resulted in the seizure of over $24 million worth of cryptocurrency. The topic of the week is regulatory guidance, starting with a joint announcement from the OCC, the Fed, the FDIC, the NCUA, and the CFPB. They proposed a rule that clarifies what guidance really is. Unlike a law or regulation, supervisory guidance does not have the force and effect of law. Therefore, it does not create binding legal obligations for the public. And speaking of guidance, the Fed published the latest version of its Supervision and Regulation Report, which summarizes the strength of the banking system in our new remote world. It outlines what they're going to focus on in their investigations, including what they're looking for at the largest and most complex firms. Also, the CFTC provided some guidance about the rare circumstances where it might terminate a consent order for good behavior. A consent order is basically an agreement between a regulated entity and the CFTC where the entity promises it won't do bad stuff anymore. The CFTC feels it's an incentive for the entity to do a good job faster because then the consent order can be cleared. So if you are a firm that got in trouble, there's hope. There's now guidelines for you to apply to end your probationary status. And finally, the most interesting guidance of all, the SEC staff weighed in on many of the changes going on in Wyoming in relation to cryptocurrency and custody. Many of you know Caitlin Long is a longtime mastermind in this space, and we bow down to you in a lesson in if there aren't rules, just make them up. Because that's what Wyoming did, and the SEC is now asking all of us to take a look at Wyoming's rule and let us know if we think they should revise the SEC custody rule relative to digital assets. Great work, lady. What a trailblazer. So, for those of you following cannabis, there were 3 alerts. A virtual vaping summit hosted by the Pennsylvania Department of Drug and Alcohol Programs. South Dakota legalized recreational marijuana to the disappointment of their governor. And New Jersey's governor appointed the official to the new Cannabis Regulatory Commission. The rest will continue to trickle in, I'm sure, now that several more states legalized it last week. In Compliance Corner this week, the real news was the CFTC's delay of the margin requirements for uncleared swaps. Yes, another delay, mostly for the small players. The CFTC also exempted central banks, sovereign entities, international financial institutions, certain bank holding companies, savings and loan holding companies, and community development financial institutions from swap clearing requirements. The SEC released some clarity around exemptions to the definition of security-based swaps, saving some groups from getting needlessly lobbed into requirements that weren't intended for them. The SEC also amended the whistleblower award amounts to provide better clarity to whistleblowers themselves about what the value is for reporting something that could be helpful. The joint agencies finalized the rule around all of the COVID relief instruments and their impact on capital requirements, so that is done. FinCEN reiterated the need for title companies to identify the natural persons behind shell companies that are used in all cash purchases of residential real estate. And in state compliance, New York reiterated that student loans still can't go to debt collection. And California issued a mandatory 1-year moratorium on insurance companies canceling policies because of wildfires. In Crypto Corner, Florida heard and provided declaratory statements on a number of petitions seeking exemption from the state money transmitter rule. Bitcoin ATMs, cryptocurrency, automated kiosks, and all sorts of interesting business models go up against the state's rule. So check it out. The FTC is sending PayPal payments totaling more than $470,000 to people who lost money to a deceptive chain referral scheme involving cryptocurrencies. The CFTC fined a Colorado company over $900,000 for a digital asset and Forex Ponzi scheme. And speaking of Colorado, the governor there appointed a new CIO and executive director of technology. In our fine tracker this week, Zoom was busted. The FTC is requiring Zoom to enhance their security practices as a part of settlement for deceptive and unfair practices that misled consumers about the privacy of their information. Zoom has agreed to establish a comprehensive security program to protect its user base, which has skyrocketed from, get this, 10 million in December of 2019 to 300 million during the pandemic. The SEC also settled with 3 traders that were caught hacking the Edgar system and trading on material non-public information. And finally, Sotheby's was nailed by the New York AG for defrauding New York State and its taxpayers out of millions of dollars in unpaid sales tax. Apparently, they were making false tax exemption certificates for an art collector and major client, even though they knew that art collector was not eligible to claim the exemption. For those of you following LIBOR transition, the OCC, the Fed, and the FDIC reiterated that they don't care what rate you replace LIBOR with, just replace it. And in our SRO watch, 2 big things. One, Freddie announced that mortgage rates dropped again, another record low, the 12th time this year. If you can buy, you're going to get a great deal right now, and go for it. And finally, as expected, NASDAQ is moving its place of primary operations from New Jersey to Chicago. In its regulatory filing, NASDAQ explicitly said the purpose of this temporary relocation is to demonstrate that the exchange is capable of and willing to operate outside the state of New Jersey in the event that the state of New Jersey enacts pending legislation that would impose a tax on securities transactions processed within the state. Is it wrong that I find this super exciting gossip? That's it for Regulator's US Alerts. Join me every Wednesday morning on LinkedIn, and for the longer version, see us on YouTube. And Wayne, enjoy the Masters for the first time ever in November.